So we have some time for discussion and questions. Maybe just, I'll get us going, but just to think about the kind of commonalities between the two papers that we listened to. I find it striking that both Harris and Sonia are thinking about poetry's interrelationship with agriculture, which is not a normal topic of discussion in poetic circles. There was a kind of conflation in both pieces with lyric, as Sonia put it, lyric and lyrics of music and poetry, and a kind of larger discussion of poetic form. Both were thinking about the roles of poetry in political movements, and then I kind of wanted to maybe start off here. I was struck by something that Sonia, when you were talking about James Forman, had a line that says, "You won't have fear if you sing." And thinking about some of the work that Harris was looking at, especially Cecilia Vicuña's, I can sort of imagine something like some Vicuña or others saying something like, "You won't be able to imagine a kind of new state without singing or poetry," or something like that. And so maybe maybe that could be a kind of starting off point for discussion. Maybe Sonia, I'll turn it to you if you want to kind of like reflect on that idea of poetry and fearlessness, and how that might, how you're thinking about how they might correspond.
I can stay here, or should I?
Can you hear her?
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Daniel. I think, in a way, I mean, we heard Foreman say it, but it's parallel to what Hamer herself says, right? And what Cobb also says about her on the bus, which is that her singing sort of gave them the fearlessness to encounter and survive the moment that they were in. And then two, I mean, Joyce Brown also sort of articulates a relationship between poetry and fear, in that she's saying fear is what prevents her elders from speaking, from being heard, from making their voices heard. So there, the poem is sort of evidence of fearlessness rather than a step toward it. So one of the things I was interested in Foreman's assertion there, especially, is that I felt that it was specific to singing rather than necessarily to having the lyrics on the page or writing them, right? It was about reading them and putting them in your body and in your mind. And if you think about the ways that he instructed in sort of choreography, but also the insistence on repetition, let's do that verse again. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. There's a sense that it's a kind of like almost like a physical training in fearlessness. In other words, it's connected to, I mean, at the same time, they're having, civil disobedience workshops and trainings that are very much connected, I think, to like literally how do you not feel afraid in a moment where you're about to be subject to extreme violence. So I think that in that sense, it's not so much that expression itself, or poetic expression, will help overcome fear, so much as like having the verse in your mind, right? Having the verse in your body and mind. So that's kind of the way that I was thinking about it in relationship to Foreman. And I suppose that relates to, I mean, I think Harris and I both were also kind of very interested in this intermediate quality. That's the word they use several times, Harris, right? The way that learning poetry has to always be thought of in terms of that intermediate pedagogy.
Harris, do you want to
Yeah, I could add really briefly. I was thinking sort of in the framing about where does the anxiety about the relationship between poetry and song come from in the histories of reading and pedagogy and so on, and I don't have a clear answer for that. Probably the first place I would go to look for one would be John's book Poetry and Its Others. But I think both of us referred to traditions of poetry today that don't share that anxiety, that imagine kind of different fluid sort of relations between intextualized and performed speech, and that also actively seek to erode the boundaries between intextualized and performed speech, and that hearken in different ways to a very important quality of every genre of poetry, which is to have a kind of performance initiative behind it, whether the structure of, say, like the hymn that has an address to God, but that's constituted by the social performance of the community, or the corrido with its particularities of particular protocols of kind of performance. So I think it's important for us to remember that all poetic genres have a kind of like social image of their performance behind them, whether or not that is enacted, and that movement poetries might be good places for that to come out a little more seamlessly.
So let's open it up to questions that folks have. Raise your hand if you don't. Do you want to stand?
Oh, I can. So this is a question for Dr. Posmentier. You mentioned while you were talking that you see poetry as relating to and responding to state vigilance and punishment in the 60s. So I wanted to ask, do you see poetry as, especially freedom school poetry, as its own sort of vigilantism and how it repossesses the tenets of the law and justice and reuses them in a way that's not approved of by the state in order to get its own message across, I guess?
I think it can work that way. Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. And actually, I was just thinking that, Daniel, we left off part of your question, which was about whether if you can't sing, you can't reimagine the state, right? And so I think that connects in some ways to the question that you just asked. So, I mean, one of the ways that I would maybe think about this, and I'm curious actually what Harris thinks about this too, is that there's something about the nature of poetry as always an improvisation on pre-existing genres and forms and media, right? That is always about remaking or reimagining, right? So that it lends itself to that process of them taking an existing structure and dismantling it, so there's something about, for instance, Joyce Brown saying, "I'm on the ground outside," right? She's complaining about it. She's saying, we need a building, and she's raising money to make a building. But there is also something powerful about that ground outside, right, in and of itself, maybe as something that is not vigilante justice, not a rethinking of justice, but outside of that discourse altogether, right? A kind of learning that's going to exist outside of the institutions of the state. But I think I should say too, and I maybe didn't stress this enough at the top, that if it's possible to imagine that in poetry, it's partly because it feels quite impossible in life. I mean, I think it's important that Hamer's, the farm cooperatives didn't work. Urban Harmon has done some interesting writing on this. So they're failures, right? And so what do you do with that attempt to reimagine the economy in ways that are more communal and less poverty-based, and the impossibility of doing that within the structure of U.S. South in that moment. So yeah, poetry is a space for that imagination, for sure.
Other questions? Harris, can I ask, in relation to what your argument was about Salvador Novo, and where your presentation and Sonia's differ, right, is in the Mexican example, revolution means revolution to support the state rather than against the state. But my impression of Novo was that he was kind of critical of the proletariat poem in that way. Do you want to maybe expand on that, or just sort of talk about I don't know what poetry looks like in a post-revolutionary society versus one that is sort of trying to create revolution?
Yeah, it's great. It's a great question. I mean, you said much of what I think there is to say about it. But I mean, Novo was a very canny critic of the revolutionary state. He also, came to later work alongside it in many ways as it developed across the sort of 50s and 60s. He became like a TV presenter and so on later on state television. But he was a significant critic of it in this phase, and that was not to, I don't know exactly where his kind of compass points would land politically. I think it's actually a little bit hard to determine, because there is a kind of like, something pointing towards like a kind of Trotskyist, like rootless anti-imperial Marxism or something that's developing for him there. It's really, there's also, many of his poems are really fascinating expressions of like queer intimacy with working men. And so there are like a range of sort of like non-orthodox relationships that he's interested in positing to like the kind of like authorized revolutionary subject, and I think he's quite frustrated with a state culture that seems to create kind of cliched versions of that authorized revolutionary subject, basically. And so that one of the reasons that those poems from that period are quite powerful, but they're also in that very powerful kind of and wry observations of what, like, I mean, he goes on and on and on about, like, the kind of rural campesino coming into the city and the structure of gay work and so on and so forth. So he's a kind of complex figure, and I just wanted to, kind of teach the debate, I guess, there in the talk a little bit. It was how I thought about contrasting Gutierrez Cruz with Novo.
Sure, one more question. Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering if both of you might be willing to do the role of ritual. Speak again. Yeah, would you feel like to speak both of you further on the role of ritual and sort of religious syncretism that's happening all around? Even as you're speaking, I'm like reminded by that line from Pizza where she talks about like the poetry of the social revolution culture. And I was really moved by something you said about how Foreman talked about getting into the spirit of the song. And so I'm actually really curious what is that relationship, because there's also this direct line from ritual, religion, religious practice, that I see in the genealogy of the thread that I'm personally really curious to talk about.
Yeah, so as I understand it, the question was for us to think more about the relationship between ritual and poetry, and the sort of direct line from sort of spiritual practice to poetic practice. Do you want to start, Harris, or should I?
I can just say really briefly. I mean, the way that this, I guess the distinctions that I put in mind are back to some like lyric theory from like comp exams a million years ago about the. I guess on the one hand, like the distinction drawn by Roland Green between ritual and fiction as the two poles of lyric experience would be one way I would start to think about that. And on the other hand, this kind of curious book by Andrew Welsh about the roots of lyric in ritual experience. And those are a couple of models for thinking about the range of ritual functions that attend a lyric poem, which are, I think, just an enormously complex part of the life of the poem. I don't want to take up too much airtime going through it all, but that would be the way I would begin to think about the landscape that ritual exerts over the lyric. Sonia, I don't know if you want to pick it up. Because I didn't hear the question, I only heard verbatim. So,
Yeah, that's very helpful to me. Taurus in terms of just sort of wanting to think more with this question. But I think, also I think in the context that I'm studying, of course, the church is just such an important physical and spiritual and communal space for the production of these lyrics, right? There, these both in the sense, of course, as Hamer points out, that many of the songs originate in Bible verses, but also in the sense that the churches are places where people learn hymns and so forth, but in this context, they're also being kind of repurposed as movement spaces, right? And in fact, Joyce Brown in her poem says, "You won't give me your churches." The church has actually, in that particular town, at that particular moment, abandoned the cause and said, "No, it's too scary. We don't want to get bombed, right? Like, don't, right?" And so she's actually pleading with the church to make a space for the movement. And so I think that there's something there where the movement verses are themselves working out a relationship to both like the traditional institution of the church and the changing institution of the church as a space for movement building and for community. That I think, if I'm not mistaken, that recording of Foreman is in Brown's Chapel in Selma. If it's not, there are many such recordings taking place in Brown's Chapel in Selma, right? And so I think there's a sort of very literal meaning too to having that in the spirit of it, right? But I also would just say that to me, the practice of rituals is also just, again, and I think this goes back to these questions about the roots of poetry. The practice of ritual also just has to do with, it's pedagogical. Like ritual is also a way of learning to believe or learning to know something about your existence. Right? We engage in rituals literally to practice the thing that we're trying to know or believe. And so I think that these scenes of recitation and performance and education are kind of in some ways restoring our sense of the ritual context. We're very modern. It's 1963, right? So it's not an old or rooted